I'd like to dedicate this talk, for whatever my words are worth, to my dear departed friend, John Vanari. I don't think that my words will have any great value for him in terms of any purgatory he might have to endure, but such is my offering today, and I miss him so much. I can tell you that we forged an even deeper friendship than we had ever had before when we both covered the so-called Synod on the Family together in Rome, and at that time there was no sign that he had a problem. And I think during those days that we spent together, we forged a bond that was deeper than ever before, a bond that I hope will endure until, please God, we meet again in the life to come. So I dedicate this talk to John. Now, the subject is what the relevance of Fatima is to us on the centenary of the apparitions. And I want to begin by talking about us, because the so-called mainstream Catholic press and the secular press alike would say that we're all a bunch of people who are obsessed with Fatima, which they tell us is merely a private revelation. You can take it or leave it, and why is this cultish group of people so obsessed with this private apparition? But when we think about what Our Lady had to say to the three seers, she essentially said, I'm making a request for the consecration of Russia, and if what I request is granted, there will be peace in the world, and souls will be saved, which is a reward of infinite worth. But if what I request is not granted, Russia will spread her errors throughout the world, raising up wars and persecutions of the Church. The Holy Father will have much to suffer, and various nations will be annihilated. Annihilated. But according to the forces of political correctness, both within and without the Church, this is just a private revelation. So Our Lady basically says to the seers, the world will be destroyed, but keep it to yourself. This is just between us. Well, that's nonsense. But Father Gruner was accused of being obsessed with the Fatima revelations, and so was John Vanari, and so are we. We're all obsessed with Fatima. But there's another group that is obsessed with Fatima, the popes. And that's the focus of my talk today, because it is not Father Gruner or John Vanari or me or the Fatima Center or any of us who have kept Fatima front and center in the life of the Church, but the popes. And I mean specifically, excepting John the 23rd, every single pope since the 1950s. Let's talk briefly about how the popes themselves seem to be obsessed with Fatima. We know that Venerable Pope Pius XII not only believed in Fatima, but told a group of pilgrims coming to Rome, and I quote, "The time for doubting Fatima is past. It is now time for action." And he took action. He had some bad information when he did so, but he took action in light of the message of Fatima. In 1942, we know that he consecrated the world, having been misinformed about the proper object of the consecration, and that 10 years later, in an apostolic letter, he consecrated the peoples of Russia, but only in a document. The public ceremony of the Pope conducted together with the bishops of the world, consecrating Russia by name to the Immaculate Heart, was not, despite his best efforts, conducted during his pontificate. But Sister Lucy was assured after the 1942 ceremony that it would lessen the tribulations of the world during the war, which was then in progress, and the war did end. And there was a period of peace following the war, at least external social peace, an absence of armed conflict. But not the conversion of Russia, Our Lady said. That would not happen unless and until the thing that she had requested, the consecration of Russia by name to her Immaculate Heart, by the Pope, together with the bishops, were conducted. It hasn't been done yet. But what did Pius XII say about what was going to happen in the Church in light of the message of Fatima? And he said this when he was still Secretary of State under Pius XI. I've quoted it before. It's worth remembering today. And he said, "I am worried by the Blessed Virgin's messages to Lucy of Fatima. This persistence of Mary about the dangers which menace the Church is a divine warning against the suicide of altering the faith in her liturgy, her theology, and her soul. A day will come when the civilized world will deny its God, when the church will doubt, as Peter doubted. She will be tempted to believe that man has become God. In our churches, Christians will search in vain for the red lamp where God awaits them. Like Mary Magdalene weeping before the empty tomb, they will ask, where have they taken him? And how many of you have seen churches where the sanctuary lamp has disappeared? And you ask precisely that question, where have they put our Lord? Now, the last four popes, Paul VI, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Francis, regarding whom I have some news flashes for you, up to the date, up to the minute coverage, that's what you're getting, from the Fatima Center. The last four popes have all made pilgrimages to Fatima. They're obsessed with Fatima. They keep going there and venerating Our Lady of Fatima, this private revelation that we can take or leave, which somehow the popes can never leave. They have to keep bringing it up and bringing it to the center of the life of the church. You can't hear me in the front row? Can everybody hear me? All right. Somebody can't hear me. Oh, okay, great. No problem. Now, let's start with Paul VI. We know he made a pilgrimage to Fatima in 1967. And during this pilgrimage, he said things which are thematic of these papal visits to Fatima, the visits that never seem to end. Pope after pope goes there. He had read the text of the Third Secret by 1967. And at Fatima, he specifically linked the Fatima message to the book of the Apocalypse. And during his sermon at Fatima on May 13, 1967, echoing what Pius XII had said in the quote that I gave you a moment ago, he said, wouldn't it be unfortunate, wouldn't it be terrible if, quote, an arbitrary and unauthorized interpretation of the church's magisterium led, and I quote again, to a dissolution of the church's traditional and constitutional structure, replacing the theology of true and great masters with new and special ideologies intended to remove from the norm of faith what modern thinking, often deprived of the light of reason, doesn't understand or dislikes, and changing the apostolic concern for redemptive charity into an acquiescence in the negative forms of the profane mentality and worldly customs. Wouldn't it be unfortunate, he said, if that would happen to the church? He said this at Fatima, having cited the book of the Apocalypse. Does that sound familiar, by the way, the development that he feared? We know that is exactly what took place in the church, a dissolution of structures and an invasion of the church by a profane mentality and worldly customs. He could see that coming in 1967. It was already happening. And only 5 years later, we know that he made the famous utterance about the smoke of Satan entering the temple of God. But he said more on that occasion. After he made the reference to the smoke of Satan entering the temple of God, he went on to say, in 1972, there is doubt, uncertainty, problems, unrest. Doubt has entered our consciences, and it has entered through the windows, meaning Vatican II, which were meant to have been opened to the light. This state of uncertainty reigns even in the church. It was hoped that after the council there would be a day of sunlight in the history of the church. Instead, there came a day of clouds, darkness, groping, uncertainty. How did this happen? He asks himself. We will confide our thoughts to you. There has been interference from an adverse power. His name is the devil, the mysterious being to whom frequent allusion is made, even in the epistle of St. Peter. And lest some arbiter of political correctness in the church say that this is an apocryphal quotation, here's the citation. The Insegnamenti, the official teachings of Paul VI in the Vatican Archives, Volume 10, 1972, page 707. So here's Paul VI going to Fatima, I would say almost in spite of himself, because he was a reformist and a kind of dilettante of liberalism at heart, to say these things about the coming crisis in the church. And then 5 years later, he lamented the church, all in the light of the message of Fatima. Now we come to John Paul II. We know he made 2 pilgrimages to Fatima. The first came in 1982, after he himself said his life was spared from the assassin's bullet by Our Lady of Fatima, because at the moment the bullet was fired, he turned to look at an image of Our Lady and the trajectory was altered. It missed the vital organs, and he survived the surgery, barely. He attributed his rescue from death to Our Lady of Fatima. And when he went to Fatima in 1982, he took the bullet removed from his body during surgery and had it placed into the crown of the Pilgrim Virgin statue. Now, what did he do at Fatima? Well, we know that he, like Paul VI before him, linked the message of Fatima again to the book of the Apocalypse, citing chapter 21. And he personally attested to the binding character of the message of Fatima on the church as a whole, saying, and I quote, "If the church has accepted the message of Fatima, it is above all because that message contains a truth and a call whose basic content is the truth and the call of the gospel itself." And he went on to say that the message of Fatima at that time, 1982, is, quote, "still more relevant than it was 65 years ago. It is still more urgent." And we know that there was a second pilgrimage in the year 2000, the very pilgrimage during which Cardinal Sodano announced that the third secret, or what they tell us is the whole third secret, was going to be released in a couple of weeks. And on that occasion, John Paul II referred to the book of the Apocalypse again, this time citing chapter 12. And he said, in regard to that citation, the message of Fatima is a call to conversion, alerting humanity to have nothing to do with the dragon whose tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. The Fatima Center, in many articles written by Father Gruner and others, has reminded people that the traditional interpretation of that passage refers to the tail of the dragon sweeping consecrated souls into corruption. They fall from their exalted state. John Paul II made that link to the message of Fatima. Between that and the book of the Apocalypse, the fall of consecrated souls in the year 2000, at the very moment the so-called pedophile scandal was about to erupt in the church. And it did erupt. I was there to cover it myself at the so-called pedophile summit, that mockery of an event. Now, in addition to beatifying two of the three Fatima seers, John Paul II has also added the Feast of Our Lady of Fatima to the Roman Missal on May 13. That's well nigh an infallible declaration by the Pope, imposing a universal discipline on the Church, the observation of a feast day, respecting the validity of the message of Fatima. Then, of course, we have Benedict XVI. He went to Fatima on a pilgrimage in 2000. And we know that at the Fatima shrine itself, he eliminated any pretense, the pretense that had been fostered by Cardinal Sodano and his successor, Cardinal Bertone, that the message of Fatima belongs to the past, that it relates to 20th century events alone. He said at Fatima, at the Fatima shrine, he deceives himself who thinks that the prophetic mission of Fatima is completed. In the Italian, he says, si illuderebbe che pensasse. He deceives himself who thinks. The English translation conveniently changes that to we would be mistaken. That's not what he said in the original Italian. He said he deceives himself. It is a deception, not a mistake, to think and to say, as Cardinal Sodano was saying at the time, and Cardinal Bertone, his successor, would later say, that the message of Fatima is a thing of the past and now it's reduced to prayer and penance. No, not at all, said Benedict. And at the Fatima shrine, he referred to the triumph of the Immaculate Heart as an event we had not yet seen. Speaking at the Fatima shrine, he said, in 7 years, you will return here today, it happened today with Francis, to celebrate the centenary of the first visit made by the Lady come from heaven, the teacher who introduced the little seers to a deep knowledge of the love of the Blessed Trinity. Then he went on to say, may the 7 years which separate us from the centenary of the apparitions hasten the fulfillment of the prophecy of the triumph of the Immaculate Heart of Mary to the glory of the most Holy Trinity. Here is the Roman pontiff at the Fatima shrine itself, speaking of the triumph of the Immaculate Heart as an event that had not yet occurred, hoping that it would occur by today, literally today, and it hasn't occurred yet. And we know why. Of course, I'm going to get to why, but we know why. Now, during the same pilgrimage on the way, we all know that in the airplane, during a press conference, at which he answered questions that he had selected beforehand to be presented to him, questions he wanted to answer, questions to which he wanted the world to know the answers. He was asked, well, does this third secret of Fatima pertain to the pedophile scandal? Not only did he say that it pertained to that, he went far beyond that. You've seen the translations that I've provided to you. You've seen it in many articles of the Fatima Center on this subject. He said that the secret pertains to future realities of the church, which are little by little revealing themselves. Little by little revealing themselves in 2010. Future realities of the church. And what do these future realities involve? He went on to say in the same answer that the greatest threat to the church comes not from external enemies, but from sin within the church. That is the greatest threat to the church, he said in the year 2010. Now, we know that the vision published by the Vatican as the entirety of the third secret of Fatima tells us nothing about sin within the church, or that the greatest threat to the church comes from within the church. We see only the final outcome of some terrible crisis in the church and the world when external enemies execute the Pope and bishops and priests and members of the laity on a hill outside a devastated city. There's absolutely nothing in the vision about the very essence of the secret that Cardinal Ratzinger revealed on the airplane. And this prompted Antonio Socci to say that Pope Benedict XVI had reopened the dossier on the third secret of Fatima, and that clearly there must be a text which goes along with the vision, which would explain how the Pope meets this fate on the hill outside the devastated city filled with corpses. And I think we know the answer. I think the answer is obvious. As the church goes, so goes the world. There's a pattern in salvation history. When the people of God fall into apostasy, there is a punishment from heaven, which falls on everyone. So there's a twin chastisement involved in this vision. Something happened in the church, leading to a crisis in the church and a devastation of the city in a post-apocalyptic scenario. And that is why the church is punished along with the entire world. And we see the avenging angel whose destructive emanation of flame is coming toward the earth and is repelled by the Virgin, but not before mass destruction has already occurred. And this is very probably the annihilation of nations that Our Lady predicted. And here's Benedict reopening this whole can of worms in 2010, bringing it right to the front and center of the consciousness of the church. And then, of course, there was his rather mysterious resignation 5 years later, which produced, resignation in 2013, 3 years later, which produced the conclave that gave us Pope Francis. Now, Pope Francis, continuing this papal obsession with the message of Fatima, as one of his first official acts, requested that the Cardinal Patriarch of Portugal consecrate his entire pontificate to Our Lady of Fatima. And I thought that was curious, because Our Lady has so many titles. It's something like 700 of them. Of all of the titles of Our Lady, to which he could have attached a consecration of his pontificate, he settled on one and one only, Our Lady of Fatima. Once again, keeping Fatima, nearly 100 years after the apparitions, front and center in the life of the church. And the Cardinal Patriarch of Portugal did consecrate his pontificate to Our Lady of Fatima. And despite all of the problems we are witnessing during this pontificate, we have to believe that that consecration will have some good effect. Perhaps not on this pontificate, but on some outcome proceeding from it. Now, we know that during the pontificate of Pope Francis, a synod on the family has led to an unprecedented state of confusion and division in the church on a fundamental question of morality. Whether those who are living in so-called second marriages, which our Lord said are adultery without exception, can receive Holy Communion. And we know that John Paul II and Benedict XVI in line with the church's constant teaching and discipline for 2,000 years, insisted that it is intrinsically impossible for people living in a condition that our Lord called adultery to be admitted to Holy Communion unless they repent of their adultery and cease those relations. And if they must, for the sake of children or some other compelling reason, continue to live under the same roof, it must be on the basis of being brother and sister, abstaining from the adulterous relations. And we know now that in diocese after diocese, that teaching is being overthrown. This is an unprecedented development in the church. And here again, Fatima comes to the fore. Because what did Our Lady indicate in the third secret about this situation in the church? We know she must have said something that indicated it, because Sister Lucia wrote to Cardinal Caffarra, one of the opponents of this change, in the 1990s, and said, and I quote, "The final battle between the Lord and the kingdom of Satan will be about marriage and the family." Cardinal Caffarra, an opponent of this disastrous change in the church's discipline and teaching, cited this reference to Fatima, provided to him by none other than Sister Lucia, who passed away in 2005, but was allowed to live on the earth till the age of 95, precisely in order to tell Cardinal Caffarra that, among other things, so that we would know that Fatima has something to do with this situation. Now, Francis is in Fatima at this very moment. This comes to the segment where I give you up to the date, up to the minute reporting on events in the church. He goes to Fatima, and in a prayer that he composed himself in Portuguese, a language he has used before, according to Crux magazine, he speaks of himself as a bishop dressed in white. A clear reference to the vision of the third secret of Fatima, in which a bishop dressed in white, whom the seers had the impression was the Holy Father. I don't know why Our Lady would have left them uncertain about that, and I'll talk about that in a moment. He refers to himself as the bishop dressed in white. So we, the Fatimists, immediately seized upon this. Well, that's interesting, we thought, and other people thought so too. Why is he linking himself to the vision of the third secret of Fatima? And others would say, the politically correct sources in the church, oh, this is a mere coincidence. You're contriving tin-foil hat conspiracy theories once again, you crazy Fatimists. But then we see an article in Crux magazine about what the Pope said in that prayer, which he did in fact recite yesterday when he arrived in Fatima. According to Crux magazine, he referred to himself as a bishop dressed in white or robed in white. And according to the Crux magazine article, and this is a left-of-center publication, this is perhaps a reference to the third part of the Fatima secret. So even Crux magazine recognizes what's going on here. This can't be a coincidence. When he refers to himself as a bishop robed in white, he links it to the baptismal gowns of people who are robed in white at the time of their baptism. But what does that have to do with Fatima? Why would he refer to people robed in baptismal white in order to refer to himself as a bishop robed in white? It has no real relation to the Fatima event. It seems to have been a setup for the reference to himself as a bishop robed in white. And now Crux magazine admits this is perhaps a reference to the third part of the Fatima secret. And then Crux magazine goes on to say, although the Vatican has long said this part of the secret, which speaks of a bishop dressed in white, who, while making his way amid the corpses of victims, falls to the ground apparently dead under a burst of gunfire, spoke of John Paul II and the assassination attempt, there are pockets of Catholics who contend this version. We're one of these pockets of Catholics who contend this version. Why? Because we're afflicted by something called common sense. Okay, let's think about this. I've been over the proofs for the existence of another text over and over again in talks that I've given. I've written a whole book on the subject. But for me, it comes down to one thing. We have no interpretation of the vision of the bishop dressed in white from the only one who could give it to us, the Mother of God. Yes, according to the Vatican, there's no interpretation. So we have to rely on Cardinal Sodano's opinion that a pope escaping death at the hands of a lone assassin means a pope being assassinated outside a hill where there's a devastated city filled with bodies. A completely preposterous interpretation. But even more laughably, at the same press conference, when Cardinal Sodano introduced this so-called interpretation, Cardinal Ratzinger said, "It is not the intention of the Church to impose a single interpretation of this vision." So the Church has no intention of telling us to embrace Cardinal Sodano's ridiculous interpretation. And yet, a ridiculous interpretation is the only thing the Vatican will offer us on the significance of this vision, this post-apocalyptic scenario in which a pope is executed on what it would appear to me to be one of the hills outside a devastated city of Rome, which, by the way, the Muslims have threatened to destroy, to occupy, raising the flag of ISIS on the obelisk in St. Peter's Square. So the mere fact, that fact alone, that we have no idea what this vision means, and that the Vatican will not tell us what it means, indicates that the Virgin alone must have explained it in a text we have yet to see. Now, moving on from that fact, Francis gave a homily at the Fatima Shrine. Today, up to the minute, coverage for you, when he canonized Jacinta and Francisco. And the homily refers to the book of the Apocalypse. Chapter 12, verse 1, the same verse to which John Paul II referred. The same verse to which Paul VI referred. And we know that that verse relates to the woman clothed with the sun, which is Our Lady, who gives birth to the Redeemer, who contends with the devil, and in the end crushes the devil's head. What did Sister Lucia say to Cardinal Caffarra about the final battle over marriage and family? She went on in the same letter to say, "But do not worry, because Our Lady has already crushed the serpent's head." So this crisis that Francis has unleashed upon the Church implicates Book 12 of the Apocalypse, the crisis of marriage and family that we're witnessing now. And we are assured by Scripture itself, and by Our Lady, because she speaks of the triumph of the Immaculate Heart, that the serpent's head will be crushed, and this crisis, along with all the other problems we're seeing today, will be resolved when we finally do what we're told to do. But this sermon is interesting in that it is a typical combination of really fine Catholic piety and the strange notions of the current occupant of the chair of Peter. In this sermon, he speaks of the book of the Apocalypse. He speaks of Mary as our mother. But then he goes on to say that he implores her help, not for the conversion of Russia, not for the spiritual conversion of the world, but for the disabled, the prisoners, and the unemployed, the poor and the abandoned. Well, these are noble causes, but they're social justice causes. Our Lady's primary objective in coming to earth was to seek the conversion of Russia and the triumph of her Immaculate Heart, the establishment of the world of devotion to her Immaculate Heart, which is a specifically Catholic devotion, and basically a triumph for the Pope in the name of God as the Vicar of Christ and for the Church. That is not the message we received at Fatima, although we must thank the Pope and thank God for the canonization of Jacinta and Francisco. And overall, we have to say that this visit by Pope Francis to Fatima once again demonstrates that Fatima will not go away. Why? Why will it not go away? Why are the popes insistent upon the continuing promotion of this message? Not only promoting it, linking it to the Apocalypse, canonizing two of the seers, enshrining it in the life of the Church, making personal pilgrimages there, and basically obsessing over it. Why? The answer is clear. Our mother, the mother of God and the mother of all of humanity, as our Lord told St. John at the foot of the cross, has a message for us. And she will not let the Church forget the message. And even popes of a reformist mentality, such as Paul VI, and we have to say John Paul II, in spite of all the good things he said, in comparison certainly to what we're seeing now, and even Francis, all of them, almost in spite of themselves, are drawn to Fatima to keep this message alive in the memory of the Church. She will not let the Church forget it. That's the answer to the question. But there's another question. Why? Why will she not let the Church forget it? One reason and one reason only. Russia must convert. Because Russia is at the center of the crisis in the world. The geopolitical crisis, worldwide, and even in local politics in the United States following the election of Donald Trump. And will you indulge me, please, if I do a little side trip into local politics here in America? When will this nonsensical Russia investigation come to an end? The investigation in search of something to investigate. I have never seen anything like it, this fixation on Russia. On and on and on it goes. This is the longest fake news story in the history of the fake news media. It just won't go away. It's like a giant hot air balloon filled with hot air, and they keep pumping more hot air into it. And more money and more investigative committees. They're investigating nothing. There's nothing there. Forgive my digression into politics, but Russia is at the center of the geopolitical situation as well. We see it now. We see it now in relations with China and Korea, and Russia is part of the axis of world problems and critical world relations. We seem to be pushing ourselves with these warmongering fools in Congress to the brink of war with Russia. And yet we have seen some amazing developments in Russia. What has happened in Russia? I haven't written on Russia in quite a while in my column on Fatima Perspectives. Why? Because before, immediately after the consecration ceremonies, the most recent of which I believe was in 2000, when everyone in the world, everything in the world but Fatima was consecrated, we've seen some benefit, I think. Just as the consecration of the world by Pius XII led to the spiritual gift of an end to the Second World War, but not the conversion of Russia, so we are seeing developments in Russia which I believe are proximate to a preparation for the consecration that will be done, finally, by some pope, maybe even this pope. He has a capacity for surprising us. He's still not gone yet from Fatima. Maybe he'll do a quick consecration at the airport. It will happen. But in the meantime, we've had these partial ceremonies. I think Mark Fellows said it. It's as if they're saying that a series of doubles equals a home run. Okay, it's not a home run, but it's a double. So we're getting some benefits, and some amazing things are happening in Russia. Now, I don't know Vladimir Putin's motives for this spiritual revival. I don't know whether he's legitimately undergone a religious conversion to Russian Orthodoxy, or whether he's just instrumentalizing the Orthodox Church for nationalist purposes. But I do know that there are some promising developments in Russia. Abortion is still legal in Russia. There's no way you could say that nation is converted. But you can see a movement which is absolutely contrary to the secularizing behemoth that is devouring the rest of the world. Perhaps the most positive development was a decision by the Russian court that the Jehovah's Witnesses pose a threat to public order. Excellent. In that regard, I recall a Supreme Court decision in Cantwell versus Connecticut. Cantwell involved Jehovah's Witnesses who were going into Christian neighborhoods with a phonograph player. They were playing phonograph records with speakers, one of those big old speakers. Remember those big ones? And they were blasting their Jehovah's Witness messages in a Catholic neighborhood, and they were arrested for disturbing the peace. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. They have the First Amendment right to broadcast their propaganda in Christian neighborhoods. Well, Russia has reversed that trend, which is a trend that's been going on for some 250 years, as you'll see if you read my book, Liberty, the God That Failed, available at Amazon.com. So we see these remarkable developments. Russia's swimming against the tide. And Trump seemed sympathetic to Russia during the campaign, which drove the world hegemon insane. They want war with Russia. They don't want peace with Russia, because Russia is a representation of everything they hate, a restoration of something resembling Christian order. Granted, it's Russian Orthodoxy. It's not what Our Lady wants for Russia, but it could presage, it could be a preparation for the ultimate conversion of Russia. I don't think we can just dismiss it. I think there are supernatural forces at work in Russia today as a result of these aborted attempts to consecrate Russia. Now, in this regard, something very interesting is to be found in the prophetic writings of Vladimir Solovyov, a mystic, a philosopher, a poet, an author, who lived from 1853 to 1900. He died at the very turn of the century. He wrote a work called Three Conversations. Solovyov was known as the Cardinal Newman of Russia. That is, someone who was not a Catholic, but was sparking conversions to Catholicism with his defense of the church. He had many great things to say about the Catholic Church and about the necessity of a reunification of the East with the West in the Catholic Church. And in the book, the work Three Conversations, he speaks of a future time when there's a terrible confrontation, a war involving Russia and forces in the East. And during this conflict, which threatens the entire world, a pope by the name of Peter II succeeds in uniting Catholics, Orthodox, and evangelical Protestants in the one true church again. And this follows, Solovyov says, a cosmic sign in the heavens of a woman clothed in the sun. And this is the signum magnum, the great sign of the book of the Apocalypse, to which Paul VI referred, and John Paul II referred, and Francis referred, at Fatima, the woman clothed in the sun. It is Mary, the Mother of God, whose sign will precede this reunification, which will happen. The only question is, what will be left of the church in the world at the time that it does happen? But Solovyov's prophecy is fascinating because of its linkage of this conversion, this reunification of Christians in the one true church to Our Lady, and therefore to the Fatima event, which was still 17 years in the future at the time he died. And sure enough, Our Lady came to Fatima to call precisely for that, the conversion of Russia, which would mean Russia's reunification with the one true church, and therefore the triumph of the Immaculate Heart. And so we see, with pope after pope, even 100 years after the time of the apparitions at Fatima, in fact, more so than ever before, that the message of Fatima remains central to the life of the church. It isn't going away. Its persistence will continue. Our Lady will continue to demand, in her respectful, motherly way, pushing the popes to keep the message alive, the one thing that she asked for in 1929, when she appeared to Sister Lucia, which has yet to be done, the consecration of Russia to her Immaculate Heart, so that Russia will be converted and the world will witness the most relevant thing of all to us today, the triumph of her Immaculate Heart, and a period of peace, true peace, for humanity. And by peace, we don't mean the absence of external conflict. We mean what St. Augustine called the tranquility of order in individual souls reflected in social order as a whole. We mean, therefore, the restoration of something resembling the Christian Commonwealth, which we see happening in a kind of tentative way in Russia and also in Hungary. I've mentioned this in other talks, that Hungary adopted a Christian constitution in 2012, expressly recognizing the right to life, defining marriage as the union of man and woman, referring to Saint Stephen the Great, and invoking the Christian roots of Europe, bringing down upon Hungary, by the way, the outrage of George Soros and the forces of political correctness around the world. That is what Our Lady is requesting everywhere in what was once Christendom, the restoration of something resembling the Christian Commonwealth, because that is the only thing that will save the world from what Pope Leo XIII called final disaster in the late 1800s. And so we can see that everything continues to center around the Mother of God as the mother of all humanity, and that the fate of the world itself, therefore, continues to center around the message of Fatima. Thank you.